Good evening, Lord Lieutenant, Deputy Chief Constable and distinguished guests. My name is Louise Malander. I'm a Professor of Law and Deputy Director of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice here at Queen's. The Institute is co-sponsoring tonight's event with the Public Engagement Team. I'm going to be chairing tonight's lecture, and in a few minutes I'll have the great privilege of introducing our speaker, Mr. Declan Lawn. But before I do so, our Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Nola Dundas-Hewitt, is going to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor.
Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome here at Queen's for what is the 5th annual Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation Lecture hosted by Queen's University Belfast. I would like to give a special welcome to His Majesty's Lord Lieutenant Dame Fionnuala J. O'Boyle and to the very senior police figures in the audience tonight, both serving and retired, who we're delighted that you can join with us. Of course, it's also my great pleasure to welcome this year's lecturer, Declan Lawn, from whom we will have the privilege of hearing his insights about policing here in Northern Ireland, in countries such as Iraq, and across the Far East and Eastern Europe as a former journalist. I'm sure those not familiar with some aspects of Declan's work are very much in the minority tonight. Declan worked for many years as an investigative journalist at the BBC, 10 of which were with Panorama, before going on to become a screenwriter and director. It was these latter roles, alongside his creative partner Adam Patterson, that brought us the multi-award-winning short film Rough, the hit shows The Salisbury Poisonings and Blue Lights. Declan's career in journalism will have no doubt informed much of his creative pursuits as a writer and a director, and so I'm sure that what he has to share will be of huge interest to all of us tonight as we explore policing and policing contexts over the years and across jurisdictions. For 180 years, Queen's has prided itself on being an institution that opens doors to facilitate dialogue, that collaborates across governments, education bodies, and the voluntary and community sectors, and that strives to address global challenges of the era. We're delighted, therefore, to once again facilitate the annual lecture for the RUC George Cross Foundation. The Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice here at Queen's works to respond to the challenges of building a peaceful and inclusive and a secure world. Research conducted here at Queen's shows that across the world, acknowledgement is a vital pillar underpinning any peace agreement. And the George Cross Foundation is a vital measure born out of the Patton Report that acknowledges the sacrifice and honours the achievements of those officers who served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary. I hope that the ongoing relationship between the Foundation and our university continues to demonstrate the strength and the resilience of Northern Ireland and commemorates the many challenges, sacrifices and the compromises that led to our current peace process. I look forward to hearing from our speakers this evening and to the Q&A discussion hosted by Professor Malander. So thank you very much again for the welcome. We're delighted to host you at Queen's University, and it's my pleasure now to pass over to the chair of the RUC George Cross Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Stephen White.
Lord Lieutenant, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, distinguished guests and friends, allow me to bid you a very warm welcome in my role as Chairman of the Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation. This event means so much to us. I think I'm one of many police officers who believe that the way that we can move forward in policing is around more, not less, community engagement. And when I look around this room, I can see some people who, even as far back as the early 1990s, helped me when I was in charge of training to bring the community awareness programme to fruition. As Nola has already said, the Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation was established in law. The same legislation, the Police Act 2000, which created the Police Service of Northern Ireland by renaming and incorporating the Royal Ulster Constabulary into its ranks. Our mandate is to mark the sacrifices and honour the achievements of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, but also importantly, and while it's always important to remember and look back, to look forward, to support the career development of police officers, to support innovations in policing. And that's why the lectures that we provide, the engagements, the visitors that we host at the Royal Ulster Constabulary Memorial Garden, and this lecture in particular means so much. I have the privilege of being the first and only police officer to actually serve as chairman of the Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation. There's myself and 5 trustees and a band of very willing volunteers who do a range of duties: tour guides, gardening and tending the Memorial Garden, standard bearing, ushering, running an oral history archive, which is over nearly 400 interviews from the service of police officers and soon the widows of police officers, because we believe their voice is also very important. But as I say, as well as remembering and looking back, we also look forward. So this lecture is extremely important, and I want to thank people like Professor Richard English and everyone at Queen's University who has been so welcoming, particularly your public affairs department and so on. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Louise to formally introduce Declan. But if I could summarise what I believe the Royal Ulster Constabulary Foundation is trying to do, 2 words I think are important: humanise and contextualise. Policing is a human endeavour. It's about interacting between police officers and the public, whether they be victims, whether they be witnesses, whether they be suspected perpetrators. It's always about the human aspect. So it's no perfect science. We don't always get it right. The thing is to learn, to move on. So by letting people know the context we served in and that we're human beings doing the best we can, I think that's extremely important. And Declan, you know how proud I am of you, of your career. I've watched it since you were a young journalist. I've seen you develop into one of the leading dramatists from this country. The fact that your series is now a worldwide hit says a lot. And I want to thank you for taking time to come here this evening. It means an awful lot to me, and I know the audience will give you a very warm welcome. And you have done a lot to humanise and contextualise policing through Blue Lights and other projects. So without further ado, let me just reiterate the very warm welcome. There are some of you in this room who haven't missed the lecture. Dame Fanula, Sirene and others, I want to thank you for giving us that support. If this is your first time here, I hope it won't be your last. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Louise again. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Nola and Stephen. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from Declan Lawn, who's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and we'll promise this to be a fascinating and thought-provoking lecture. After that, we'll have time for question and answer, so I'm looking forward to that as well. Our speaker, Declan Lawn, as you've heard, is a distinguished investigative journalist and acclaimed writer. He worked for the BBC television for many years, including working here in Northern Ireland as part of the Spotlight programme and working with BBC Panorama as well. He left that career to become a screenwriter and a director, a career in which he's had considerable success. So working alongside his creative partner, Adam Pattison, he has written and directed the multi-award-winning short film, Rough, the BBC hit TV show The Salisbury Poisonings, and the feature-length film Freeguard, a psychological thriller starring James Norton and Gemma Atherton. He is also, of course, the co-creator of the award-winning Belfast drama Blue Lights. Earlier this month, it won the Best Drama Series at the prestigious Broadcast Awards in London. Blue Lights is now shown on TV networks across the world, and it focuses on characters working in the PSNI and highlights the challenges with their personal and professional lives. It's currently filming its 3rd series, and a 4th series has already been commissioned. Tonight, he's going to speak on policing at home and abroad. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Declan.
Good evening, Lord Lieutenant, Pro Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen. It is really great to be here. I was conscious thinking over the last week or two that the title of my talk this evening is a little presumptuous, because to give a lecture to police officers and former police officers about policing is not something that a civilian should usually attempt. So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm not going to spend the evening pretending to know about things that I don't know, but instead I'd like to talk about my own experience of policing as a journalist and as a writer. And I hope that in doing so, I might be able to provide a few insights that are valuable to you. So really what I'm going to talk quite a lot about is what it's like to write a television drama in Northern Ireland in your own voice, in your own time, and in your own place, about the police. I'd like to talk to you about some of the challenges that we face in doing it, some of the things that I've heard from police officers in the course of my research. I'd like to tell you what the central themes of Blue Lights are, which it struck me when I was writing this lecture. I've never actually shared it in any talk or with anyone ever about what the show is really about, so you're special. And I'd like to talk about making a show that aspires towards some kind of authenticity. Now, the words authentic drama sometimes feel like a contradiction in terms, because drama, good television drama, demands certain things and authenticity demands other things. And it's the central struggle of my creative life to make a police drama based here that feels authentic even to police officers. And we don't always entirely succeed in it, but we hope that we kind of capture the basic emotional truth of what it's like to be a response officer on a call sign on a difficult call. The first responsibility of me as a writer basically is to be entertaining, to grab the audience's attention and keep it. Because if I don't do that, then nothing else that I want to do is going to matter, because people won't be watching and the show will be cancelled. But if I can succeed in doing that and keep people watching, then I think what we're trying to do in this show is an attempt to paint a portrait of a post-conflict society with all of the compromises, all of the idiosyncrasies, and all of the conflicts that that entails. Now, that is a tall order, and it feels to me like a really, really big responsibility. And I think in order to explain how I do it and why I do it, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am both professionally and personally, and how, aged 45, I ended up writing this cop show set in Belfast. Now I'm 48, and I can assure you that in the last 3 years, I have only aged by a decade. Later on, I'd be very happy to take any questions at all that you might have about the show or anything else, including, of course, why I killed Jerry. I sometimes think that if there was a crime of murdering a fictional character, I would have been arrested, charged and convicted long ago, and spending my time in Maghaberry. But before we dive into all of that, I would like to thank my old friend, former Assistant Chief Constable Stephen White. I first got to know him 22 years ago in Basra in Iraq, where I went to make a documentary about him. And at that time, I was a 25-year-old, freshly minted new BBC reporter. It was my first time in an active conflict zone. And looking back on it now, it felt like that time was a very important moment in my career. It was a moment when I began, I think, to learn some lessons about journalism and even some lessons about life. And those lessons subsequently fed into everything that I did afterwards, including how I write screenplays today. The main lesson that I learned is that narratives compete with one another in our world, and how in both journalism and screenwriting, people who tell stories have a huge and sometimes very oppressive responsibility to try their best to tell the truth as they see it and as they've researched it, regardless of the consequences. So just to start off this evening, I'm going to play a little clip which is like a minute-long introduction to that documentary. Now, I myself haven't seen this in some time, and I'm terrified about how young and good-looking I look in it.
It's 6 months since the war, but it's been a hot and bloody summer in southern Iraq. Basra is suffering from a massive post-war crime wave. By night, lawlessness grips the city, and tribal gangs vie for power on the streets. The soldiers on patrol are back in body armour as the city sits on the brink. In charge of restoring law and order is one of Northern Ireland's top policemen, Assistant Chief Constable Stephen White.
Yeah, but that's the problem. They only fire a few bullets. Where is the grenade? Where's the grenade? Where's the knife?
One of the most senior coalition figures in southern Iraq, he's on the front line of a war on crime, trying to bring law and order not just to a chaotic country, but to a police force shaking off its brutal history. His mission in Iraq was to command 1,500 international officers, but only 15 have arrived. Just as tensions within the local force reach boiling point. This is the story of how a policeman from Belfast is fighting a new kind of battle for Basra.
So that was September 2003, and most of the facts and footage that we put in that documentary, actually, we only found out when we got there. So before we arrived in mid-September 2003, it wasn't immediately apparent, even to us, that things were particularly bad, because the narrative back home in London was slightly different. You had soldiers patrolling in their berets at that time. All of the pictures that had been beamed around the world about the conflict were, pictures of the Saddam Hussein statue being toppled, and so it was only when we got there that we found a situation that was not quite as we had anticipated it. There were a couple of things that happened. There was a gun attack on the military about a week before we arrived, and then a couple of weeks previous to that, you'll probably remember that 6 Royal Military Police officers were murdered by a large gang of people in Maysan province, which is a few miles away from Basra. So when we arrived, we actually went to stay in a kind of rundown hotel in the city centre, thinking that that would be safe. But within about 2 days, we realised that there's no way it was going to be safe, and we ended up first. Stephen offered us a couple of camp beds on the roof of the electricity station, and then we moved in to a tent. So we were there because of Stephen, and it was immediately apparent this gargantuan task that he had in front of him, because what he was trying to do was construct really a working police force in the middle of what was becoming an escalating military conflict. It was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And there's a saying in journalism that you have to be there. And I think this was really the first time as a young man that I really understood this. You need to feel the heat of the sun on your back, and you need to look at people in the whites of their eyes as they tell their stories, and you kind of need to earn the right to report on things. And then, if you're going to tell a truth that is difficult or unpalatable, you can stand up straight and stand over it. In the end, we did tell a truth, and it wasn't what some people in London and Whitehall wanted to hear, and it got Stephen in a bit of hot water, but I'll tell you a bit more about that later. But the lesson that young man there was learning, or starting to learn, is that you need to write what you know, and if you don't know it, you need to learn about it, and to learn about it, you need to be there. There's just no alternative. And that is something that I carried with me through the rest of my career in journalism and then into writing drama. So if you don't mind, because I think it's salient, I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to be there in the first place, because I think in the way that I write and the concerns that I have about this place in terms of policing and everything else, I think the way that I was brought up feeds into all of that. So I was born in Derry in 1976 to parents who were from Donegal and Galway, who moved to Derry in 1974. Now, I've never seen a list of people who moved to Derry in 1974, but I imagine it's a pretty short list. They were bank officials, and the bottom line for them is that if you were prepared to work north of the border, the money was better and there were better opportunities for promotion. So they were 25 and 24 at the time, and they had the confidence of youth, and they made the move. And I was born there in 1976. And so my earliest memories were of that city in the early 1980s. I'm sure there are probably people in this room who know exactly what those memories consisted of. And suffice to say, as I got older and kind of realised what was happening around me, I spent quite a lot of time in my early years wondering if my parents were going to make it home from work, which was not an unreasonable anxiety to have in Derry in the early 1980s. But my upbringing here in Northern Ireland was an unusual one, I think, for the following reason. So my parents were in this place, but they were not of this place. They lived in it, but they were kind of separate from it, and politically, psychologically, and emotionally. They read the Irish papers, they watched the RTE news. They were outsiders, I would say, in this place. And my father in particular, he conducted himself in a way that some people might have taken issue with, others might have seen as hopelessly naive, and that so many of his social contacts stretched right across the community. He just didn't care what your background was, whether you were a strong Republican or a Unionist, as long as you liked a pint. In Derry, we lived in the waterside because back then the threat to bank officials living on the city side was quite significant. We were in a mixed housing estate, and for much of that time, one of his closest friends was an RUC officer who lived directly across the road. Then later, we moved to Ballymena, a quieter place, of course. His best friend there was in the Orange Order, and my father died in 2009. And behind his coffin, there were many members of the local Orange Order walking along with members of the local GAA hurling team. So I'm not saying he was a special case. I think there was probably a lot more people like that throughout the conflict, but he was one of those people. And so I think this had kind of a profound effect on me. So I feel that in Northern Ireland, we tend to learn our deep tribal affiliations at our mother's knee, and I didn't do that. The upshot of it for me as a child is that I didn't understand the environment that I was living in. And it made me very, very curious. I wanted to understand this world around me, which was a world that all of my friends, even in primary school, seemed to have very confident opinions on. And I think those early years of not understanding led me to two different careers that were both actually about understanding: journalism and then screenwriting. I felt deficient in my knowledge, and so from a young age, I just wanted to know as much as I could. Journalism and screenwriting are a little bit different in this respect. Journalism is about how the world works, and screenwriting, drama, is about how people work. But they're both about understanding things. My dad, I think, recognized this in me quite young. One of the things that we used to do as I was growing up was every Tuesday night watch the Spotlight programme. I would be allowed to stay up late to watch it. And so when I finally ended up working there, he was very proud, and so was I. So my takeaway from growing up in that way, I think, was this. It's just, you should judge people as you find them. We all live in a world of competing stories, the stories that other people tell us, and the stories that we tell ourselves. And I was kind of always interested in all of those stories, even when they conflicted, when they interacted. How two completely different versions of the world can be earnestly held and held in good faith. That was fascinating to me, and it still is. So I was always interested in being a writer, but I started with journalism because I needed a paycheck and I needed to earn a living. So I was doing a master's degree in Trinity College Dublin, kind of thinking about academia, and one morning I was in the Oscar Wilde Centre in a seminar about Samuel Beckett. It was a really sunny morning, and some of those moments in life you remember very well. And I remember the sun coming in the big Georgian windows, and me at about 24 years old saying, I think I need to get out there. I didn't know where or what, but I felt I needed to get out of the academic environment and experience things. And they say be careful what you wish for, because I was doing a little bit of journalism on the side at that time. I managed to get a job in Spotlight in BBC Northern Ireland only about 4 months later. And about 3 weeks after that, I was in Eastern Europe in Lithuania doing an investigation into organised crime, people trafficking between there and Northern Ireland. Very different, right in at the deep end, feeling entirely out of my depth, and still was a year later when I ended up in Basra to meet Stephen. Now, I thought we had a clip earlier of the bit where Stephen gets in trouble. Would you like to know about Stephen getting in trouble? So this is what I was talking about earlier, about kind of having the guts to tell it as it is. I actually don't believe we have that clip. But what happened was I was talking to Stephen about police officers. He needed more police. He realised that in this deteriorating environment was not what you need. Not what you needed was more soldiers in hard helmets carrying MP5s, but what you really needed was police. You needed to restore civic society and the rule of law, and he wasn't getting it. And he said it, and he said that if there are police officers in the UK who, if there are people in Whitehall who believe that being a police officer in Basra is too dangerous, then it made him embarrassed to be a police officer. We put that quote obviously into the show because it was incredibly relevant. It caused quite a bit of controversy, brought up in Parliament. Stephen was briefly recalled to London to account for himself, but he told the truth as he saw it, and I believe, given what I saw there, that he was right. I believe that policing fulfills a role that is crucial. It is a touchpaper for society. And if you get it right, or at least aspire to get it right and keep trying to get it right, then things are going to get better in all sorts of other ways. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment when I talk about my research into blue lights. But that lesson of saying what you think, even when it can hurt you, is something that I took with me then into journalism, and it really informed my outlook. And I would often remember when I was in big, difficult legal investigations with, Lehman Brothers or huge financial institutions, sometimes getting a legal letter every hour. I would think back to that, and I would kind of find the courage to say, no, I genuinely believe that what I'm saying is true. It had quite a profound effect on me, which is why we're talking about it tonight. But journalism was a great life, an interesting life, and it took me all over the world. Did I think about policing much when I was doing it? When I was confronted by the police, I didn't give it any more thought than any other aspect of the country I was visiting. Sometimes in South America or Eastern Europe, you would have run-ins with the police, and they might be difficult. But generally, it was really just a thing that we had to navigate as journalists. And then there came a time when I decided to leave journalism after many years of going around the world and doing very interesting stories here as well in this post-conflict society. And the reason, the deficit that I felt and that I really missed was talking about character. So what used to happen was that we would interview someone really quite inspirational or amazing or tragic, maybe for an hour and 30 minutes, and we might put 2 minutes of it into a panorama. And I remember I was working on the border between Lebanon and Syria, and I met a man called Gavin who worked for Concern, who was in his early 60s. He was from County Clare, and he told me this incredible story about how his daughter had died in a car accident about 3 years previously, his only daughter. And the grief was so much that he and his wife broke up. They couldn't stay together, they couldn't experience it together. And he found himself aged about 60 in rural County Clare, having very little experience of foreign aid work or even being abroad, really. Applying for a position as an aid worker, and he got it. And when I met him, he was working on the Lebanese border, kind of trying to process Syrian refugees who were streaming over the valley in like their tens of thousands. And he, in his tent that night where we stayed, there's an old Irish song called From Clare to Here. He had a guitar and he sang it, and we filmed him singing it. And I came back and I put all of this into the film, including the song, and over him singing the song, his voice, we had pictures of all of these poor people coming across the border. And I brought it into the edit suite, and my editor came and looked at it and said, "What's this?" And I said, this is an amazing story about an aid worker. And he said, but that's not what we do, Declan. Like, you know, we hold power to account. We're not here to do this. And that was one of those moments where I thought, but that's kind of what I want to do. That's what I want to do. So a couple of things happened to spur me on. As I said earlier, my dad died in 2009. I was 32 at the time. And that had a huge impact on me. Part of me kind of instantly realized that you just can't wait around to do the things that you have on your mind. I knew then instantly that life is inherently unpredictable. Funnily enough, in the kind of synchronicity of life, 3 weeks later, a young man walked into the Panorama office called Adam Patterson, who's from Northern Ireland. So we kind of hit it off immediately, being from the same place. And as soon as I met Adam, he was telling me that he loved journalism, but he really wanted to direct films and television. That was his kind of passion. And so for the first time in my life, I found someone who was articulating what I also wanted to do. It didn't happen immediately. Adam and I worked on documentaries for 4 years until one night in about 2013. We were covering those bad riots up in Ardoyne, and we came back to his flat in the city centre, and we had a medicinal whiskey, and we decided we were going to try and write a short film. And that short film was made 7 years later. In fact, we spent 7 years writing countless scripts and sending them to agents and sending them to production companies, giving them to anyone who would listen. And we basically lived with wholesale rejection on a constant basis. And I often think, and Adam says as well, if it had been just one of us, we would have stopped. But every time I was saying, I can't do this anymore, he would say, let's just do it for another month. And similarly, the following month, he'd say to me, I can't do it anymore. And I'd say, let's give it a month. And that lasted 7 years. So eventually, we got our break, and in the way these strange things happen, it happened two things simultaneously. A short film called Rough, which we got to make at the end of 2019, came out in 2020, and then the Salisbury poisonings. So just as we were both kind of extricating ourselves from journalism, and we got a call from a production company to say, are you the writers who are also journalists? And we said, yeah, that's us. And they said, look, we've got, a couple of £1,000. We could send you to Salisbury for a week and a half to look into what happened with the nerve agent attacks, which had only happened 3 months previously. And we ended up staying there for 4 months, again, because of that lesson that I'd learned there in Basra, which is you can't do it remotely. You can't speak to people over the phone. You can't do Zoom calls. You can't read articles. You have to be there. And so that project went very well. And it attracted a lot of viewers, and it was our big break, and we were kind of on the road now together, and we knew that this is what we were going to do with our lives. And then a friend of ours called Louise Gallagher, who produced the short film, came to us and said, she's a producer, and she said, I would like to make a television series about response officers in Belfast, not detectives, response officers. A very close friend of hers had left social work age 41 to become a response police officer in Belfast. And Louise said that this person's experience was just so incredible, the things that she was hearing as a producer, that we should meet her. Now, we were extremely trepidatious when the idea for Blue Lights was mentioned. Policing, as we all know, is a political but politicized thing in this society. And we worried that by doing a show about the police, that immediately a large chunk of the population just wouldn't watch it anyway, or wouldn't watch it and still have a go at it. And we were concerned about the idea of doing it. But we went to meet the person Louise was talking about, and their story was genuinely incredible. And they said, I've actually got a couple of other friends who in my section who are response officers. Would you like to hear from them? After those 3 meetings, Adam and I were all in. For this reason, we saw it as an opportunity to tell a story about the whole society through response officers who are out there on the front line dealing with everything that's wrong. A lack of resources on their own behalf, a lack of resources in terms of mental health, a lack of medical resources. We knew from what the people we'd spoken to were saying was that we could say something about a post-conflict society, about where we were going. Adam and I we were post-conflict journalists in Northern Ireland. We weren't conflict journalists, and I think that conflict journalists count the cost, and post-conflict journalists, or conflict journalists count the bodies, whereas what we did was count the cost. We were looking at the cost of our divided society, and this project was in front of us, and we looked at each other and we thought, are we going to be brave or are we not? Because if we're brave, we're going to tell a story about policing. With warts and all, we're not going to whitewash it. We're not going to say they're absolute heroes. We're just going to try our best to tell it like it is, and in doing so, say something about this society. So we did what we always do in those situations. We went back to good old-fashioned journalism. We just met as many police officers as we could. And I've found that pretty much everything in Blue Lights that resonates with people, not just police officers, but all audiences, are things that have come from the mouths of real officers. There's a phrase that Jerry uses in season 1, take a beat, which came directly from the mouth of a response officer who was telling me what he does when he goes into a house. Regardless of what he sees in front of him, he just takes about 2 seconds to make sure that no one's going to jump out and attack him. So I just said, thank you very much, I'm going to take that, and people will think I'm a genius, but really it's you. So all of the things that people like about the show are grounded in interviews that we've done, notes that we've taken. It was a huge deluge of information that we got, very hard to get our heads around it, some of it very personal, but we used all of it. And what you have to do when you're confronted with all of this information that police officers give you, if you're going to make a drama, is you have to find a theme, and you have to work out how the theme is going to express itself. Now, a premise is different. A premise is obvious. The premise of Blue Lights is that 3 new officers join the PSNI. But what's the theme? This is the idea that runs through every single scene, and once you have it in your head, you can write. It's kind of subliminal and subconscious for the audience. You don't want to be too obvious about it. But if you have it, the audience will find something cohesive and coherent about the show, but maybe not even know why. So our theme is change, and it happens in kind of 4 different ways. First of all, personal change. How does your environment change you? We're looking at it from the perspective of being a new police officer. And how can you change your environment? So this expresses itself through a dichotomy we have in the show between idealism and pragmatism. So the character of Grace is an idealist, Stevie is a pragmatist. And as their journey goes on, Grace realizes that you can't just be an idealist. You have to temper it with a certain measure of pragmatism if you're going to succeed. Stevie discovers that you can't be what he calls a bucket man all the time. You can't just go to work and do 7 or 8 calls a day, or however many you do, and go home and hang up your uniform and not think about it. Life just doesn't work that way. Once in a while, you do have to go the extra mile. So this dichotomy, idealism versus pragmatism, is, if you look for it, the next time you watch Blue Lights, any season, including the upcoming season, you'll see that it's pretty much central to every scene in the show. Helen, who's a sergeant who becomes an inspector, is an idealist who stands up for her section, but as she moves up the ranks, she is forced to become more of a pragmatist, and rightly so. The other aspect of change we look at is how can you change your environment? So at the end of the day, I think this is what we all want as humans, just to think that when we get out of bed in the morning, that we can have some kind of effect on the world, that it's not just endless, pointless repetition. In episode 5 of season 1 of Blue Lights, Jen asks Annie if she really likes this job. And Annie changes the parameters of the question. She answers by saying, I think it's important. And it strikes me that there are some jobs where just by the way that you interact with people, you can really change things in big ways and small, and policing is one of those jobs. I was speaking to a very smart young response officer recently who said to me, when we meet people, it's often the worst moment of their lives. For us, it's just another call, but for them, they might be thinking about this moment for years, so how we act really matters. I think that's a very close sentiment to what Annie was saying. So all of us, I think, in whatever role we're in life, have a kind of startling capacity, if you look for it, to have an effect on the world, even though very often we don't see it or don't think about it. But the police, more than most, last Monday, I met an officer in Fermanagh who's a tutor con, another very smart man, and he said to me, I said to him, what's the first thing you say to these new probationers that come through that you've got in your car? And he said, well, I go up to them in the locker room and I say, can you point in order of, list in order of importance what 3 pieces of equipment are most useful? And most of them might point to their handcuffs or their radio or their Pava spray. And he points to their brain and their eyes and their mouth. And he says those 3 things will get you out of more trouble than anything else that you're carrying on your belt. So how you can change your environment. The other thing that we talk about a lot in Blue Lights, that is a theme, is institutional change. So how does institutional change happen? Of course, the person at the top is crucial and the senior leadership team they have around them. But also in terms of mid-level management, I think people in leadership positions really matter. They massively set the tone. I found that the same in the BBC as any other organisation, and definitely in the police. But here too, in real life, there is of course a tension between idealism and pragmatism. There's how the PSNI would want to comport itself in an ideal world, and how it has to at times. Jonty explains this to Helen in season 2. They're all getting into armoured tangies and pangolins, and he says, sometimes these things invite more trouble than they solve. But that is life. They still get into them. There's no easy answer. And I'm not going to try and lecture anybody about the way forward because I frankly don't know enough about it. I'm not a police officer. But I do know that the key thing in institutional change is having an open mind and also having values that mean even if in retrospect you do take the wrong step, that you were doing it for the right reasons and that you have the capacity to correct it afterwards, and that is very difficult. All organisations get it wrong, but I think that an alertness to the need for change and an ability to listen to people who have ideas for change is crucial. Here's another small example for you. I spoke to a young female officer recently from a nationalist area who had had a threat against her. It was a very difficult situation. It had happened about a couple of years earlier. And when it happened, she felt very isolated, from the organisation, and she felt very, very alone. She felt she wasn't given enough information, and she almost left. But in the end, certain things happened, which meant that her ideas for change for officers in that position were listened to at a high level, and she decided that because that happened, she was going to stay. And I was speaking to her just last week, and she was saying she's really glad she did. So I think the one question for any organisation, whether it's the PSNI or the BBC or anyone else, is how can we change for the better? And if the answer is we're fine, we don't need to, then that's when you know that something is wrong. And the last aspect of change we look at in the show is social change. So it's a really difficult, I think, sometimes onerous task to reflect society here. But social change is at the heart of what we're trying to talk about in the show. I have seen enormous changes in the, whatever it is now, 24 years since I moved back to Belfast from Dublin. It's a different city for the better, but have we moved on in all the ways we should have? No, absolutely not. But what our show is trying to do is simply show the different viewpoints and narratives and how they interact with each other in a non-judgmental way. So what I mean by that is there's a scene in episode 5 of season 2 of Blue Lights where Jen, who is now a lawyer, doing what she should always have done in life, is having a massive row with her mother, who's a chief superintendent, about the past. And a lot of things are wrapped up in that conversation. Their history as a mother and daughter, the way that their difficult relationship in the past. But Jen is arguing that all secrets, all of them from the past, need to be out on public display. It's a very, very valid viewpoint. And her mother is saying, there are things that I know that even now, if they came out, would be profoundly destabilising for this place. Another very interesting and valid viewpoint, right? My job in writing those two characters is to flip between those two viewpoints, which I heard from people in journalism, given earnestly and with evidence, but not to make a judgment call on either, to say, here you go, here's Jen, this is what she thinks, here's Nicola, this is what she thinks, to simply present that. And I'm feel very privileged to be able to do it. And I think it's crucial that we hear those voices in our show, crucial for here, I hope, but also for people across the water in GB, in England, Scotland and Wales, because I think sometimes Blue Lights can show them things and tell them things about this place that I actually found quite difficult to approach in journalism. A kind of emotional truth that's hard to get to when you're just making a spotlight or a panorama. So finally, I'm going to give you just my very brief takeaways from researching the show. I would say for every series of Blue Lights, I probably talk to somewhere between 20 and 30 police officers, and I always do my best to reflect their experiences in the show, but recalibrate them significantly so that nobody could look at it and go, oh, hang on, that's me. Generally, when I've been exposed to young officers in response, the PSNI allow me to go on ride-alongs with a particular section in Tennant Street. I've been very impressed by their commitment, their courage, and above all, their resourcefulness. At times, I have been blown away by how scarce those resources have been at times in the city centre on a Saturday night, and the way that they kind of at times ingeniously get around that and do the best with what they have. Yeah, I've always just, almost every time I've been exposed to those young people, I've been very impressed. If you want to know what their biggest complaint is, I'm sure some of you who are serving police officers know what I'm going to say. It's spending far too much time in hospitals with patients who are having mental health episodes and being off the ground for hours at a time, feeling very frustrated because they're in a hospital filling a role that they haven't been trained for as a mental health nurse, and listening to their colleagues in the radio getting it tight. Now, to some of you who served in the RUC, that might seem like a minor complaint, but in my experience, it just comes up again and again and again, and it really matters in terms of resources. Secondly, I think there's quite a lot of undiagnosed trauma in the police amongst serving officers. Now, that's different to what it was 30 or 40 years ago. It exists for different reasons. The threats are different. The experiences are very different. But I have sat with officers who witnessed horrific instances of domestic violence, sometimes involving children, who have attended RTCs in which children have died in front of them, and who have simply seen things that none of us as humans are programmed to see. And I'm frankly not sure that how many of them are getting the help that they need, and sometimes for some of them that is because they haven't asked for it. I find that when the public hears figures on radio programs like 600 officers off work with stress, it's always presented in a way that suggests they are somehow malingering and that it's an excuse to stay at home. But when you sit in front of officers and hear about the things they have seen and dealt with, I think people listening to those radio shows would feel very, very differently. And that's why in an upcoming series of Blue Lights, I'm going to have a storyline about an officer who is traumatised at the scene of a fatal road accident, which I think, for me, is one of the most important stories in the next series. So, finally, coming back to where we started, is the show authentic? I suppose in a sense it is. It does its best to tell real stories and put real ideas and situations into a TV drama. But of course, at the same time, we have to consolidate timelines and stories and squeeze an awful lot in. So probably, if you're a real police officer watching it, you think an awful lot more is happening to this section in this period of time than could ever happen in real life, unless you're having a very, very bad fortnight. And there are times, I admit personally, when it feels like a lot. You know, telling, as I said earlier, a story about your own place, in your own time, in your own voice, is a huge responsibility. And sometimes I even think it feels quite oppressive. There's no way of pleasing everybody, and I have no interest in trying. But there is a way, I think, of respecting everybody and realizing that my story may not be someone else's story, of presenting different voices, different opinions, and putting those in the mouths of different characters. That is not some kind of postmodernist relativist argument in that all stories are equal. They're not. At the end of the day, we all come from a place of our own values. But it is, I think, a broad extension of those lessons that I started to learn 22 years ago with Stephen as a young reporter in Iraq. Ultimately, when it comes to writing a show like Blue Lights, you have to be there, you have to listen, you have to collect all the information that you possibly can, and then you have to present the truth as you see it, even if some people find it objectionable. So, do I like it? Well, as Annie says, I think it's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Declan. That was a really powerful talk, I think. There was much that resonated with me strongly when you're thinking about the connections of your personal background and experiences and how that shapes the professional choices you're working on. One of the themes I found most interesting, and I am going to open this up for questions to everyone in a moment, but while you're having time to reflect, I thought I'll ask one. I'm a scholar of transitional justice, which means I look at how societies around the world recover from divided pasts. Sometimes I research Northern Ireland, sometimes I research other contexts. And increasingly within my field, there's a growing recognition of the power of the arts in all their forms to help people put violent pasts behind them. And that's something that's came through in your presentation about how in Northern Ireland we have different narratives, how we don't always hear other narratives or aren't willing to listen. So what is it that makes a TV drama a really powerful means to get us to hear each other's stories in different ways?
So in one word, it's character. Mm-hmm. So the way that Adam and I write is that we, in the very initial stage, we come up with characters and we invest a lot of time in those characters. So they might be based on kind of someone we've met, but more often they're based on like throwaway comments by people we meet. So I'll give you an example. I was speaking to a police officer and it's never the things that they think they're telling you that's important. It's something they just say and the antenna goes up. And somebody said, oh, you know, like kind of most stations would have a police officer who's not supposed to be a police officer. And then he was moving on. I said, whoa, hang on. What do you mean by that? He said, you know, someone who just, it's just not for them. Physically, they're not up for it. They don't like the physicality of it. They're more nervous and anxious than they thought they would be in training. And, you know, after a few months, they realize, actually, I don't like it. So that was the genesis of the character Jen, who has joined the police because it's kind of family tradition, but realizes when she's in there that even the young probationers who are coming up through have more courage than she has. Now, in the end, Jen's character arc is that in the moment when she really has to find courage, she does, and she's redeemed by that. So Adam and I find that if you can come up with characters that viewers like and love even maybe, and want to follow, you can then explore so many intellectual and ideological positions through them. Whereas if you tried to do it without investing in the characters, it would seem dogmatic and didactic and sterile. So it's all about the characters for us.
Okay, thank you. That's fascinating. I guess we should open it up to questions from the floor now. There should be microphones, I think, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, a microphone will come to you. Thank you. I can see one question here and then one at the back. So if you want to introduce yourself as you're asking the question, please.
Sure. Thank you, Louise. Declan, thank you for a brilliant lecture. So I'm Kieran McAvoy. I work here at the Mitchell Institute
Hi, Kieran.
Along with Louise. As you were speaking, I was thinking, and I know drama is different than academia, but as you were speaking, I was thinking, so whenever I'm supervising PhD students, and see if I have a PhD student who's doing something on the cops, then I'll always say to them, look, when you're hanging about with cops all the time, you're going to get to really like them because they tend to be very funny, quite charismatic, they have interesting lives, they do things that matter, and you could end up getting sucked very much into their worldview. Yeah. And obviously as an academic, that's something you have to be careful of, so I'll always say that. If you're spending a lot of time talking to cops, listening to cops, hanging about with cops, and all the rest, are you ever worried as a dramatist that you're getting too sucked into their worldview?
I kind of think that my 16 years as a journalist helps me there, you know, to be to take a step back and be kind of dispassionate. There's no doubt that, say, I don't know, you're spending a bit of time with a couple of young officers out, in the back of a car. Of course, there's a danger of getting sucked into it. In some ways, it's exciting and dramatic, and what they're doing, in my opinion, is generally very admirable. But I always think there's a thing that I have, and Adam has it too, where you're able to step back, and it's like I mentioned in the lecture. I'm not interested in some kind of benevolent whitewashing. I want to see all the bad bits as well, not just the resource problems, but even sometimes the cultural problems. And there's I can think of lots of storylines that we've done and are doing, like Annie Conlon having to leave her camogie team and really not getting an awful lot of backup or support institutionally. But that's one of many I could point to. The activities of Murray Canning in season 2. It's really, really important to us that it's not just aren't they wonderful, because that's not real life either. It's not that way in the police, and I don't think it's that way in the BBC or in any large organisation. It's a mixture of people, So Stephen said something earlier, though, which is, and I think this is distinct from being too enamoured by the police. But one thing that I think we do, and I'm very proud of, is I think we humanise them. So this has happened in my own head. So previously, before I started making blue lights, if I was walking down the street and I saw 2 police officers coming towards me, I would only see the uniform. I wouldn't even look at their face. I wouldn't see it, it wouldn't register. And now every time I see police officers, I look at their face. So that I'm happy about. But no, I think I have a kind of enough decorum and discipline not to drink the Kool-Aid. I hope so.
Okay, thank you. I think there was another question towards the back there by the aisle.
Thanks, Louise. Johnny Byrne. Declan, thanks for that. I was just wondering, did you feel, in terms of Series 1 and 2, that you had to cover the orange-green loyalist Republican context in terms of Northern Ireland and policing? And is it difficult to do in terms of not getting sort of sucked into the rabbit hole? And then, is it easier now? I'm guessing Series 3 isn't maybe loyalist or Republican, but is it easier or harder to write about policing in that context without focusing on the traditional Northern Ireland story?
Yeah, good question. So when we wrote season 1, we didn't know that we'd get a season 2, but we knew that if we did, we wanted to look at the other side. Maybe that was an old journalistic impulse, but the other massive reason was that Adam and I spent quite a lot of time in loyalist communities doing documentaries, and we're totally fascinated by it. We both spent time with different marching bands, and we're fascinated by that community and where it's at and where it was going. But we really wanted to tell a story about loyalism that was kind of respectful, as best we could. So in terms of season 1, there just wasn't enough room to do that. But we knew if we got another season, we would. And so we did. And so season 3 goes somewhere, I think, quite unexpected. It's essentially about the professional apparatus around organised crime. So it's basically set more or less where I live, BT9, where the real criminals live.
Thank you. I think there's another question here at the front.
We seem to be seeing a return to Catholic disaffection from the PSNI. Do you have any theories to explain that?
I don't have any theories, Malachy, but I think it's very real. I would say the number of recruits west of the ban is probably pretty low. I don't have the figures. I was, talking to a police officer who works west of the ban recently, and who was saying that just in terms of his perception of being out, doing nightlife officer after pubs, he still experiences quite a lot of hostility in certain towns. Theories, no, but is it real? Yeah, it's real. until recently, I still played GAA, member of the GAA, member of my local club. I think it's, you know, in our club in South Belfast, I don't think there would be any issue genuinely with a police officer playing for us. I don't think anyone would care. But I imagine that in certain places in the north, it still would be, which is why I wanted to, well, I mean, the Annie story in season 1 was taken from a friend of mine. So I'm giving you a kind of slightly circumlocutory answer here because I don't have theories. I don't know why, but it's definitely real. Like.
I can see another hand over here. Thank you.
Hi, Lynn Knox. I'm ex-RUC PSNI. I just wanted to pick up on your comment, Mr. McAvoy. I think it's really interesting, you know, that viewpoint. Did you get sucked in to the sort of policing culture? And I just want to say thank you, because I think your programme actually does humanise police officers, displays that we are just people. We go to work, we try to do a good job, and we go home to our families like everyone else. So I just want to say thank you for showing some of the values and the reality of policing.
Thanks. Yeah, as I said to Kieran, as I said to Kieran, that feels like the case for me personally, and if it's the case generally, I think that can only be a good thing, so thank you.
Maybe got time for one more question? Yes, there's one hand there at the back.
Hi there, I'm Marcia Henry. I'm also from the Mitchell Institute. We seem to be dominating some of the questions here today. I'm really curious if you feel, I don't know, pressure to incorporate sort of storylines or topics from other police drama series from around the world, you know. So I'm thinking about, you know, the politics of Black Lives Matters or, you know, misogyny in the police force, etc. I'm just wondering how you respond to those sorts of themes in other programs.
So there's an awful lot in that question. I'm particularly interested at some point in doing a story about the way in which racial hate crime is prosecuted in Northern Ireland. I did a law degree here in my 30s, and that's what I wrote my thesis on. And there's a lot of flaws in that system, a lot of flaws in the criminal justice system. So there's a lot in your question, but I'll try and be as brief as possible, right? So I love watching cop shows, and Adam and I have two favourites. One is The Wire in Baltimore, and the other is Hill Street Blues. And we just constantly watch those shows, and particularly in terms of the direction, which Adam leads. He basically does all the lead directing. He steals a lot from Hill Street Blues, like a lot, and I'm very happy that he does. And so we watch a lot of cop shows. Those are probably our two favourites. So, you know, there's a lot of good ones out there. And in terms of dealing with big issues, like I'm constantly looking for things like that to look at, yeah. And particularly, you know, the idea of race and ethnicity in Northern Ireland and the police force and what it's like to be an officer of colour there. Absolutely fascinated by that. It's something I definitely want to do in the future. So season 3 is being filmed right now. That'll be out later this year, and then I start writing season 4 soon. I think we have enough real estate on that to look at quite a few things. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think it's been a wonderful evening. Before we close, I just want to say a few words of thanks. So firstly, thank you to the public engagement team for arranging all the logistics this evening, and thank you to Brett Walker and the Mitchell Institute for his work in promoting tonight's event. I also want to thank Professor Hewitt Dundas for giving a very warm welcome to the university, to our speaker, and also a warm word of thanks to Stephen and his colleagues at the Royal Ulster Constabulary George Cross Foundation. It's wonderful, I think, for Queen's to partner with you again this year. Thank you all for being here this evening and for participating, and for a very brilliant talk that's given us lots to think about where our society is in Northern Ireland, about the place of policing within it, and about the power of the arts to help us recognise the humanity in each other. I'd like to thank our speaker very warmly for being with us this evening. Thank you.